everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Cole Akers, and I'm a curator at the Glass House, and it's a pleasure to introduce tonight's talk. Before we get started, I just want to quickly thank the Josef and Anni Albers Foundation, the New Britain Museum of American Art, and the New Canaan Library for co-hosting tonight's event. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Glass House, we're a site of the National Trust for Historic Preservation in New Canaan, Connecticut, and the former home of the architect Philip Johnson and his partner David Whitney. Today we present a variety of programming that focuses on art, design, architecture, and landscape as a way to sustain the site's historic role as a cultural gathering place. Tonight's talk is a part of an exhibition called Pliable Plain, where we've collaborated with the Albers Foundation on a new bedspread and other textiles for the house as a way to celebrate the work of Anni Albers. The bedspread and the textiles are based on some of her early designs. It's also a way to think through her friendship and longstanding collaboration with Philip Johnson. So with that, I'd like to introduce Fritz Horstman, who is a fantastic artist, as well as the Director of Education at the Albers Foundation. He's organized a number of exhibitions based on the work of Josef and Anni Albers, most recently at New Britain, about which we'll hear more in just a bit. Fritz will speak for about 45 minutes, and afterwards we'll take questions, so please feel free to use the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen. So with that, Fritz, thanks so much for being here. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Cole. It's great to be here. It's a real honor to have been invited to speak with you all and to work with the Glass House. As Cole said, my name is Fritz Horstman. I'm the Education Director at the Josef and Anni Albers Foundation. And in addition to the project that Cole mentioned that the Glass House and the Albers Foundation have collaborated on, we have just finished installation of an exhibition at the New Britain Museum of American Art. We were literally 2 days away from finishing the installation and opening it to the public when the museum was forced to close because of the COVID-19 crisis. So we are hoping that a timeline will be established soon, and we'll know when we can open that exhibition to the public. So I'll say much more about that soon. All right, I'm now going to share my screen to get this started. Okay, so Cole, I think if you are still unmuted, if you could just let me know if you are now seeing my PowerPoint.
It looks good.
Thanks. All right. Okay, as Anni Albers once said, the process of making textiles, like that of making architecture, is building a whole out of single elements. In this talk, I will attempt to bring together three subjects. The first subject is a description of Albers' life and art. I will continue that story as I talk about the temporarily suspended exhibition at the New Britain Museum of American Art, which covers the 44 years that she lived in her adopted state. A theme of that exhibition is Albers' fluid movement between her work as an artist and as a designer. A topic brought into focus in her interactions with Philip Johnson. I will conclude with an upcoming collaboration that Cole just mentioned between the Glass House and the Albers Foundation. Anneliese Fleischman was born in 1899 in Berlin. Though her family's wealth could have allowed her a life of ease and luxury, she was more interested in learning how the world is made and how to make things herself. This led her in 1922 to the Bauhaus, the famous German school of art and design. Here we see her in a studio photograph from around that time. The Bauhaus was among the first art schools in Germany to accept both men and women, though most women, including Annie, were placed in the weaving workshop. Though at first she was dismissive, saying that threads were, in her words, too sissy of a material, they won her over, and it was there that her genius with threads first started to show itself. She created masterful designs for textile and rugs, and eventually ran the workshop for a short period. Annie is in the far right in this photograph. The man on the far left is the painter Georg Mucke, who for several years was master of design in the weaving workshop. At the Bauhaus, each workshop had a master of design and a master of form. The master of design was, in almost every workshop, a painter and was responsible for guiding the workshop's aesthetic. The master of form for each workshop was someone with a high level of technical skill in that particular field. For much of the time that the weaving workshop existed, the master of form was Günther Stölzl. In this photograph, she's in the upper left, just in front of the woman in the white collar. I think you can probably see my cursor, that's her there. This 1924 wall hanging is among the first weavings that Annie created. Already, we see her design sensibility and sensitivity to materials. A weaving is created from the bottom up, as threads are layered one on top of another. In this detail, we can see the various threads that she is working with, building, as she said, a whole out of single elements. Many of you may be very familiar with how a weaving works, but I include this image from several years later showing Annie working on a loom at Black Mountain College to illustrate the basic technique. You can see Annie is pulling a bar towards her, known as the beater, which is compressing the weaving on which she is working. There's a series of threads that are running over the bar on which she rests her elbow, and another series of threads that interlace those threads perpendicularly. The first group of threads running over the bar and held in tension are called the warp. The second, which interlace, are the weft. To make this a little bit clearer, I've made this drawing. This also illustrates that in weaving, there's always a horizontal and always a vertical, a parameter which Annie brought forward in her weaving and used to highlight the materiality of her work, as well as to make clear the method of its construction. In 1925, Mucha, the master of design, purchased several Jacquard looms for the weaving workshop. Jacquard looms are very complicated and not particularly well suited to the work in which the weavers were then engaged. Mucha had never learned to weave, and so it was frustrating to the weavers that he had done this with no input from anyone else in the workshop. Nevertheless, Albers and her colleague Günther Stölzl taught themselves to use the Jacquard looms. Developed by Josef and Marie Jacquard in the early 19th century, the Jacquard loom allows a weaver to more easily create intricate patterns, including curves. Here we see the gouache study that Albers made in preparation for an early Jacquard weaving. And here's the corresponding weaving that she produced on the Jacquard loom. The weaving is intricately syncopated in a way that would be very difficult to make on a less complex loom, but remains true to the rectilinear nature of weaving. More interesting to her than including curves in her weaving was working on a more sophisticated level with horizontals and verticals. As a measure of Albers's restraint and ethic, here's a weaving of Stölzl's from that time period, showing the curves and expressive complexity for which she is famous and which is possible on a Jacquard loom. At the Bauhaus, Annie met fellow student Josef Albers, whom she married in 1925, taking the name Anni Albers. In this photo, we see them around that time, clearly very much in love. During that period, Josef Albers was making what he called glass paintings, such as this, Factory. It has been observed that his work from that time period looks an awful lot like a plan for a weaving, and more specifically, like some of Annie's work from around that time, such as this study for an unexecuted wall hanging. That said, many years later, she recalled that neither was copying the other, and that they had both been inspired by the architecture in Tuscany, where they went for their honeymoon in 1925. And that the highly contrasted horizontal bands on the facades of the churches there found their way into both of their work. Decades later, the Alberses returned to Tuscany, where Josef captured those horizontal bands on the bell tower of the Duomo di Siena in this photograph. It's not entirely a coincidence that that visit happened there, and just a few years ago, the Albers Foundation organized an exhibition just across this piazza in the Musée de Santa Maria della Scala. Literally every day I would walk out of the museum and look exactly at this scene. So all things come together. In 1928, the then director of the Bauhaus, Hannes Meyer, had a commission to build a trade union school in Bernau, Germany, just north of Berlin. Here's an aerial view of the completed project. The complex included this auditorium, which Meyer discovered had a significant problem with echoes. He asked Annie, still a student at the Bauhaus, if she could develop a fabric that might cover the walls and dampen the echoes. Here we see it with the walls covered in the fabric that Albers designed. An economy of materials and effort was at the heart of Bauhaus teaching and was central to Albers' design. She produced a two-sided fabric, which in itself is not a technical breakthrough, but in this case, each side served a different purpose. To produce more light in the auditorium, she made one side of the fabric shiny using thin strands of the then brand new material called cellophane. The opposite side was made of cotton chenille, which served to dampen the echoes in the room. In this historic photo, we see that the acoustic properties of the fabric had even been tested and charted. In this contemporary photo of a reproduction of the fabric, we see the silvery cellophane side juxtaposed with the fuzzy chenille. The chenille would have faced the wall, while the cellophane would have faced the room, reflecting light. Albers was awarded her Bauhaus diploma in 1929 for this remarkably efficient and beautiful fabric. In the late 1920s, the architect Philip Johnson, who was then in his early 20s himself, visited the Bauhaus. He and Annie met and had an immediate connection. A few years later, with the Bauhaus closing under pressure from the Nazis, he happened to be back in Berlin and they met again. In the 1970s, he recalled that meeting, or rather, in the 1970s, Annie recalled that meeting.
There was Philip Johnson in the doorway and I said, how nice to see you. Would you have time to have a cup of tea with us? And he came the next afternoon and I showed him some of the things. We had known him, of course, before already for a little while. And he said, would you be interested in coming to America? And that was just at the very brink of things happening in Berlin. And we said, why, of course. And 6 weeks after that, we received a letter from Black Mountain College, which was a newly founded college, very much on the experimental side. But we are interested in having art as a central point of our college. Would you be interested? And I remember that Josef and I sat in our bedrooms with the legs hanging over the edge of the bed and read this letter together. And when it came to the word experimental, we both said, that's our place.
To my knowledge, there are no photographs of Johnson at the Bauhaus. Though to help draw that time to mind, here we see him in Switzerland in 1933, near the time that he and Annie met again in Berlin. He was traveling then with Alfred Barr, the founding director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where Johnson directed the architecture department for many years. I think it's very likely that on the same journey that they were in Switzerland, they also went to Berlin. During an Anni Albers exhibition at the Jewish Museum in New York in 2000, Sadat Paquet filmed Nicholas Fox-Weber, the director of the Albers Foundation, interviewing Philip Johnson, who recalled that 1933 meeting.
And when I met them in the Bauhaus, the one that attracted me was Anni, and we got along house of horror. But she was a person that you could make immediate contact with as a person. And I thought she'd be marvelous for Black Mountain. And I thought Black Mountain would be, I knew would be great for Albers, and that was clear. But that Anni would fit in like a hand and glove.
The Alberses arrived in New York aboard the SS Europa in November 1933. After a weekend in the city, which included time with Johnson, they took the train to Black Mountain, North Carolina, where they would live and work for the next 16 years. Johnson was right, it was a natural fit. The progressive pedagogy that they had absorbed and developed at the Bauhaus gave form to the learning by doing ethic of the school's founder, John Andrew Rice. Though Annie was to teach weaving at Black Mountain, upon her arrival, there was no loom on which she could teach. Forced to invent a new way to begin teaching weaving without a loom, she sent her students out to gather seeds, which they glued onto paper. They not only developed a sensitivity to the textures of their materials, but also to the system that was necessary for the seeds to take on the look of weaving. That system required a horizontal and a vertical. These images come from her 1965 book on weaving, but refer back to the early 30s when she had just arrived at Black Mountain. She had her students create a similar system of horizontals and verticals on a typewriter. The typewriter study on the top comprises only backslashes and colons and underscores, but in repetition and in order, gain texture and the feeling of a textile. Below, it is only capital and lowercase s's and underscores. Giving a weaving from around that same time, titled Ancient Writing, takes this way of thinking to a far greater height. Albers would have been aware that the etymological roots of the words textile, text, and also architecture all come from the same source, the Proto-Indo-European word tex, meaning to build or to weave. All of these words connote combining simple materials to build something more complex. In Ancient Writing, she has created a feeling of writing and thereby implied a message. On closer inspection, we can see that it's an invitation to look closely at her choices of threads and weaving patterns. This untitled weaving from 1941 does something similar. What at first appeared to be a fairly regular pattern reveals itself a wildly varied and syncopated pattern. Albers referred to this and to many of the weavings we're looking at as pictorial weavings. By that, she meant that they were meant to be seen as art, on par with more commonly accepted art forms like painting and sculpture. Denoting them as pictorial, she makes clear that these weavings are not meant to be used as designs for upholstery or used as placemats or anything else other than art objects. In closer detail, we see some of those many different weaving techniques that she used and some of the different threads that are combined here. In 1946, Albers completed what I consider to be one of her masterpieces. The pictorial weaving with verticals is fairly large at 61 inches tall. Its effect from a distance is both playful and spatial. I find that its design transcends the category of weaving, leaving me to revel only in its rhythms and structure, unworried about technique. But on close inspection, the technique is engrossing. We see that what reads as a complicated series of diagonals are in fact varied twill weaves, made up of horizontals and verticals. The dark vertical bars serve as a sort of conceptual railing, reminding us of the building blocks of weaving. In 1949, the Alberses left Black Mountain College. After 16 years, they were ready for something new, though at the time they didn't know exactly what that would be. The year before, Edgar Kaufman had visited Black Mountain and had invited Annie to have a solo exhibition at MoMA, where he was director of the Department of Industrial Design. The exhibition, installation views of which we see here, happened in 1949. At that time, Kaufman had left MoMA, so the project was curated by Philip Johnson. Both Kaufman and Johnson saw Albers' remarkable dual identities as artist and designer. In the image on the right, we see on the back wall 3 pictorial weavings, being Untitled from 1941. Along the right wall is a curtain of Annie's design, along with several fabrics that have been draped. The functional fabrics are shown alongside the artworks. A chair upholstered in Albers' fabric is canted in a way that denies its usability as a chair, but that draws attention to the fabric. This was the first solo exhibition of a weaver and among the first solo exhibitions of a woman at MoMA. In the following years, it would travel to 26 museums in the United States and Canada. The Alberses moved to Connecticut in 1950, when Josef was made chair of the newly formed Department of Design at Yale. Annie, for the first time since she was a student at the Bauhaus, found herself without formal teaching responsibilities. That added time, combined with the professional confidence that must have accompanied the MoMA exhibition, created the circumstances for Albers' prolific period. The 44 years that she lived in Connecticut were her most productive and most artistically varied. The first weavings that she created upon setting up her studio in their new home in New Haven was Black, White, Gold 1, in which we see one of the first examples of Annie implementing the plasticized metallic thread known as lurex. In all of her work, she was attuned to the visual haptic quality of her materials, that is, how a material looks like it would feel. Further, how she treated materials and how she combined them could enhance the overall visual haptic effect. By combining the shiny gold of lurex with dull, rough jute and cotton, both textures were amplified. Incidentally, Black, White, Gold 1 is featured prominently in the exhibition in New Britain. More on that soon. A few years later, in 1959, she wove "Sheep May Safely Graze." In a 1974 interview with Nicholas Fox Weber, she recalled the process.
Started out with the threads and what was on the loom, and gave the material and the process a chance to do something. Sometimes a title came in the course of the work, like for instance the one with this kind of white woolly cross that I did once, which I called "Sheep May Safely Graze," like the Bach
Albers
chorale.
was an avid listener of Bach. It's hard to think of a composer who made more thorough use of the fundamental building blocks of his medium. In listening to his Goldberg variations, for example, one can almost hear him thinking through every possible combination of the motif, building it up, taking it down, and building it up anew. Though that sounds perhaps tedious, Bach's dogged recapitulation produced some of the most inventive and beautiful music the world has yet heard. The beauty of Albers' weaving lies in a very similar understanding of her medium. Her constant refrain was that an artist must understand the fundamentals of the materials and process before anything approaching art can be made. She built her weavings and prints out of parts, her way of allowing us to see, it was her way of allowing us to still see those parts, to understand the process that makes her work so beautiful. By taking a title from Bach, she may be showing us a page from a playbook. In 1968, after creating Epitaph, Albers stopped weaving. She was 69 at the time and had become increasingly reliant on a wheelchair. This was far from the end of her artistic career, but weaving had perhaps become physically too intense, or perhaps she was simply ready to try something new. Whatever the case, she left weaving at the very top of her form. Epitaph is a wonder. With a background woven of gold lurex ribbon, the meandering white and black cotton threads flicker and dance, a sort of scroll, written in an unknown language, or as a particularly lyric combination of materials. When she was a student at the Bauhaus, one of her professors had been Paul Klee, who famously instructed his students to take their line for a walk. An epitaph, woven more than 40 years after first hearing Klee's instruction, Albers' black and white threads may simply be out for a walk. I'd like to turn now to the exhibition at the New Britain Museum of American Art, through which we'll also be able to see Albers' transition making. In thread and on paper, Anni Albers in Connecticut explores the incredible work that Albers produced while living in Connecticut from the 1950s through 1994, when she passed away. The 116 objects in the exhibition include an extensive body of textiles, wall hangings, commercial collaborations, and works on paper. It is the first museum exhibition dedicated exclusively to the artist's output in the 44 years that she lived in Connecticut. Originally slated to run through mid-June, we plan to extend the exhibition's run once the museum's reopening dates become clear. This photograph, which is included in the exhibition, comes from sometime around 1960 and shows Albers in her home with the weaving Black, White, Gold 1 behind her in the exhibition. We've already had a look at Black, White, Gold 1, but I'd like to look a little closer to really see the way she has brought material and process together. Perhaps it's a little easier now to see the gold lurex that lies between the jute and the white cotton here. Again, those threads are all warp threads and the horizontal threads are all weft threads. So we can see the lurex only lies in the warp and or rather in the weft, and the warp is composed of white cotton here, and there's some more white cotton, black cotton here, and then the jute is also running mostly in the weft. Made in 1952, the weaving entitled 2 is blocky and rectilinear, and somehow still feels organic in composition. 2 comprises 2 closely related but different ideas, as seen by comparing the lighter colored background threads to the brown and yellow threads in the foreground. The brown and yellow threads exist only in the weft and are interwoven loosely, creating a soft brocaded satin texture. Their high contrast, angular, blocky structure imply a sort of architecture, or possibly the letters of an unknown language. Much quieter, the lighter areas reveal a subtle syncopation in their checkerboarding, created by a warp laid out in a pattern known as end on end. Now, I'm talking about these areas here. So if you compare this block to this block, in reality they're each about 1 inch square. And you can see that they're very similar patterns, and simply it's a matter of varying the way that the threads are moving through that she's created this syncopation. If you look at that in a larger context, say comparing these 5 blocks together, you can see the way she's created this sort of checkerboard across the entire thing. Up until now, all of the weavings we have looked at have been shown as they were made on the loom, with the warp threads running vertically. By looking closely, we can see that after she removed it from the loom, Albers turned this weaving 90 degrees. So the warp threads now run horizontally and the weft threads are vertical. We see the AA of her signature, and below that, along the bottom edge, the selvage, where each pass of the weft threads wrapped around the outermost warp thread and turned back for another pass. So I'm talking about this very bottom here. You can see these threads are turning, and that is the selvage. So this line of turns here. All of these threads come down and they wrap around and go back. So these, in this case, the vertical threads in this case, because she's turned her weaving, are the weft. And then off to the right, we see the cut edge of the warp threads. Turning and weaving 90 degrees may not count as the wildest move an artist could ever make, but it shows Albers' nimble design mind, always sensitive to what her materials wanted. It is likely that Albers wove 2 on the Structo Artcraft loom in the center of the first room of the exhibition. Over the course of the exhibition, the loom will be woven upon set days by weavers. The weavers will be producing replicas of some of the small textile samples that Annie made. When the weavers finish the reproduction samples, they will be made available for visitors to touch. Adjacent to the pictorial weavings are 24 textile samples that Albers created between around 1950 and 1960. Going back to her time at the Bauhaus, where the different workshops were charged not only with teaching and learning, but also with creating products that could potentially be sold to support the school, Annie had developed an ethic of making objects that were both beautiful and potentially useful. For the rest of her career, she was able to keep a balance between the two, working both as a commercial designer and as an artist. These textiles samples show some of the range of the materials she used and the various processes she applied. For the sake of time, I've not included much about Annie's long fascination with the ancient Peruvian weavers, whom she considered to be some of the field's greatest practitioners. By studying their work, she learned the technique of lino weaving or gauze weaving, a process she applied to white linen in this example. The same technique was used here with either jute or hemp in the warp and lurex in the weft. In detail, we can see more clearly what's going on. The warp, which is running vertically, has been twisted between each pass of the weft, creating spaces. As those spaces accumulate, the overall effect is a sort of net or gauze. Having adhered almost religiously to the horizontal and vertical imperatives of weaving for decades, Albers experimented with more curving lines in this design for a rug from 1959. With thread still very much in her mind, she let the lines meander and knot. Design for a Rug remained a series of drawings and gouache painting in Albers' lifetime. It was not until a 2009 collaboration between the Albers Foundation and Christopher Farr Rugs that the entangled braided lines, so carefully given the texture of a tufted rug in the 1959 drawing, were realized as a rug. The drawing and rug hang together in the exhibition. Annie visited Tamarin Lithography Workshop in Los Angeles in 1963 with Josef Albers, where he had been invited to create a suite of lithographs. The experimental prints she made that year were her first foray into the medium that would become her preoccupation for much of the next 2 decades. Awarded a fellowship at Tamarin the following year, Annie's veneration of process and sensitivity to materials allowed her to move naturally into the medium. The master printers at Tamarin encouraged her to experiment with the workshop's acid baths, creating a modeled cloudy ground that would be superimposed with her linear designs based on knots and tangles of thread. Line Involvements was published as a suite of 7 lithographs, 2 of which are included in New Britain. Beginning with the silkscreen print Camino Real, Albers was preoccupied by various triangular motifs for nearly 2 decades. Made as a study for, or possibly as a reflection on, a commission for a hotel in Mexico City, the hundreds of triangles appear to be simultaneously ordered and yet chaotic. While similar designs can be seen throughout human history in Native American baskets and blankets, African wood carvings, Islamic ornamentation, ceramic tiling, among others, Albers wasn't making specific reference to any such sources. To her, the repeated triangles were pure abstraction. Where texture had been the preeminent concern in her weaving, color became increasingly important in her prints. Her focus on material and process led her to try a wide variety of printmaking techniques. This trial print is embossed onto a metallic laminate paper. Mountainous, a suite of 6 inkless embossed prints from 1978, are completely white. The only indication of form is given in the shadows cast by the low ridges of the embossing. In 1972, Nicholas Fox Weber introduced Annie to Fox Press, his family's commercial printing press in West Hartford, Connecticut. Weber facilitated the production of several prints designed by Albers and printed by Fox Press, including Fox 1. Comprising 2 layers, the first is a rendering of Albers's pencil drawing transferred to a silkscreen using a process called photo offset. A second layer was produced using a process called ruby lith, in which a thin film was precision cut to fill the voids of the pencil drawing. When the 2 are overlaid, the result juxtaposes the soft lines of the pencil with the crispness of the orange ruby lith. Close inspection reveals that the image at the top is an exact inversion of the image below. And by that I mean these 2 orange triangles become these 2 pencil triangles down here. These pencil triangles here become these orange triangles here, and so on. The final room of In Thread and On Paper is devoted entirely to Albers's engagement with the repeated triangular motif. In the center of the room, we have installed 9 white textile samples that Albers designed in the late 1970s and early 80s for the company's Sunar and S collection. Not designated as pictorial weavings, these were mass-produced and were intended for a specific use as curtains. In the exhibition, they create a sort of ethereal fabric cloud, intentionally blurring the line between art and functional fabric, much as Annie did with so much of her work. And here's one of those textile samples isolated. We learn so much with our hands, and textile calls to be touched. So we've devoted the second room of the exhibition to educational and interpretive material. that can be explored haptically with your hands. In addition to the textile samples that are being produced on the loom and can be touched, we've built a large table with a gridded top. Plastic triangles of the same size as the grid are available for visitors to manipulate, experimenting to recreate patterns like Albers's or to come up with something completely new. Graph paper and pencil was the starting point for much of Albers's artistic output. This large-scale version of that allows visitors to experience the incredible range of designs possible in such a simple format. There's also a large weaving wall on which visitors can try their hands at actually weaving, using materials very much like those Albers used. Over the course of the exhibition, the community will collaborate to create a large weaving. The final view one has on leaving the exhibition is of two large tapestries flanked by several repeated triangular prints on the one side and the diaphanous textile samples on the other. The large tapestries were created in 1984 as a commission for the AT&T building in Manhattan, designed by Philip Johnson. Johnson had met Albers 57 years earlier at the Bauhaus. He had been instrumental in bringing Annie and Josef to Black Mountain College, had curated her exhibition at MoMA, and had worked with her on other commissions, on another commission that I've not included here for the Rockefeller House, for the Rockefeller Guest House, omitted for the sake of time. Those many decades of interaction with Johnson made Albers an ideal first candidate to be featured in the Glass House's new series, Pliable Plane, which in fact takes its name from the 1957 essay of Annie's about the relationship between textiles and architecture. The Glass House, built in 1949 by Johnson, will invite an artist or designer to refashion the house's interiors with site-responsive textiles. For the first in the series, the Glass House and the Albers Foundation are collaborating to create a new bedspread and window panels based on original works by Anni Albers and installed in the transparent pavilion sleeping area. In his lifetime, Johnson, of course, lived in the Glass House, and so the textiles within the building were occasionally in need of change. Though it is preserved in a very clean and perhaps Spartan way, the house was lived in. There was at one point even a shag rug. Along the back glass wall in this undated photograph, you can see two opaque panels, which could be moved as needed to block the sun. Working with Leipzig, Germany-based weaver Katharina Jebsen, the Albers Foundation and the Glass House are creating a fabric that replicates this textile sample of Annie's made between 1950 and 1960. The resulting fabric, which is in the works at this very moment, will be used as a new bedspread and sun panels. To finish, I'd like to give Annie the last word. Annie, whose life included extraordinary difficult circumstances, said this in her essay, One Aspect of Work. Our world goes to pieces. We have to rebuild our world. We investigate and worry and analyze and forget that the new comes about through exuberance and not through a defined deficiency. We have to find our strength rather than our weakness. Out of the chaos of collapse, we can save the lasting. We still have our right or wrong, the absolute of our inner voice. We still know beauty, freedom, happiness, unexplained and unquestioned. That's what I'd like to share. Thanks so much. I'd love to answer some questions now.
Fritz, thank you. That was really fantastic and so beautiful to see all those details of the weavings. There are a few questions that have come in. I'll just do them in order.
Okay.
Did Annie feel that her shift to America, was her shift to America an influence in her work? And if so, how?
Well, without a doubt, yes. And I'll try to answer it simply, but it's a gigantic topic. Of course, leaving her native Germany and coming to the United States, how could it not have been a huge impact on everything? I suppose one aspect where things were particularly focused, the students at the Bauhaus were art and design students. So Annie had gone there with the specific interest, with a specific idea of studying art. All students at the Bauhaus were in some way doing that, whether they were going to be architects or something else. When they came to the United States, not only had they left cosmopolitan European life and come to rural Southern American life, also it was a liberal arts college, and so the students were of a very different variety. They were there to study everything. And so although Annie had only taught for a short while at the Bauhaus, and mostly she'd been a student, she needed to recalibrate what her teaching would be when she came to the States. So her teaching work changed dramatically in that way. Her artwork, also the Bauhaus, there was this expectation that she would be working for industry. And in some way, the artworks that she produced were, they weren't secondary, but they were sort of a separate thing from the industrially inclined textiles that she was making at the Bauhaus. When she arrived in this country, there was no longer this strong drive to create fabrics that could be used, although she kept doing that for many, many years. This sort of opened things up and allowed her to explore the pictorial weaving idea that she developed so much in the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
That's great. Another question is, in her piece 2, it looks like the brown thread also has flecks of a thinner black thread in it. Are the black and brown a single thread, or did she add the black as well? Where did they source the threads? Did she ever make her own thread?
There's a lot there. I'm unable to answer specifically whether the black and brown threads are intertwined in that specific piece. We would need to do a very close analysis to make that determination. Annie generally did not spin her own yarns. For a short while at Black Mountain, she did dye some of her own yarns, but in general, she engaged with what the industry was already producing. So she would find the yarns that she wanted and use those, and find what they were capable of, and then push those to find their limitations and their potentials, as opposed to creating her own material. She was aware that good materials were already being made.
Some other, just perusing some of the other questions, maybe one question could be, are there any other collaborations that Annie took on? You know, we spoke, of course, about her collaboration with Philip Johnson, but I wonder if there are any other notable collaborations that you might speak about, maybe some of your own favorite.
Yeah. Well, of course, the project in Bernal would certainly count as a collaboration. It's often asked whether Josef and Annie ever collaborated, and aside from some Christmas cards, there's very little evidence that they ever did collaborate. Towards the end of her weaving career, she had a couple of commissions from synagogues. So Annie was raised in a Jewish household, was never practicing, but nevertheless had that identity. And towards the end of her weaving career, was approached by a few different synagogues to produce weavings for their chapels. There's one in Dallas at the Temple Emmanuel there, which is absolutely beautiful. And then another, which was in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, which was 6 panels that sort of telescoped in such a way that you could slide them like sliding doors, and they would cover the ark, the Torah, and then on high holy days they would be able to slide back. And these 6 panels were woven around the same time as her very last weaving, Epitaph, and had a vaguely similar aesthetic and material use. And unfortunately, that synagogue is in the process of closing, and so the Albers Foundation, very fortunately, has been able to reacquire those panels, and they will be included in an upcoming exhibition in Paris, which was due to open in September, but of course has been postponed. We're now looking at opening that in March.
Oh, fantastic. And how long will the show at New Britain be up for? Do you know just yet, or is that still being determined?
Yeah, we don't have the specific dates yet. It was initially planned to be March 19th through June the 14th, but of course those dates are no longer relevant at all. What we are hoping is that when the museum is finally able to reopen, we will set the clock again and say 3 months from now, it will run from that point. But there's a lot of unknowns within that statement. So
fair enough. Let's see, maybe one other question here. There's a question about why the specific textile was chosen for the glass house, and I guess that's something I could answer.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, there are going to be a few fabrics on display. Fritz mentioned the bedspread. That one is being woven at the moment, as Fritz said. The textile that we chose was one that wasn't meant to be a bedspread, but it was one that we felt could be easily adapted for the bed in many ways. We should also say that the sun panel that we're creating is based on the commission for the Rockefeller Guest House in the end in New York, which we could easily share some images afterwards. But there'll be, there are a number of collaborations, of course, between Johnson and Albers. So it's a way of sort of hitting all those different notes in the show.
Right. So there, you have the gallery building, which is a separate building from the actual glass house, and so there will be a small exhibition of those things there. Is that right?
That's right. Exactly.
Great.
There's a question here saying, were any of her patterns commercially mass-produced? Maybe if you could talk a little bit about her collaboration with Knoll, possibly.
Yeah. So for many years, she worked with the company Knoll. And some of those patterns that she developed for them are actually still in production. They were all certainly mass produced. Some of them were simply taking some of her repeated triangular motifs and applying those to embroidery or to other weaving techniques. She also worked with the company Maharam, and at least one of those patterns is still in production. And of course, the Sunar and S collection textiles, the ones that I shared, that sort of that diaphanous cloud of textiles, though those are no longer in production, those were certainly a commercial mass production when they were being made.
That's great. I think maybe there are so many questions, but I know we spoke earlier that maybe we could try to get to some offline another time. So I think with that, I'll just leave it and say thank you so much, Fritz. We really enjoyed that, and look forward to seeing you in person sometime before long, I hope.
Yes, I look forward to that also. Thanks so much, Cole, and thanks for everyone who came. I've not been able to scroll through all the participants, but I see a lot of old friends' names in there, so hello to all of you. And to new friends also. I hope everyone's staying safe and healthy, and that we'll get through this before too long.
Thanks, Fritz.
All right, thanks, Cole. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.